By the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler appeared unstoppable. In less than 2 years, Nazi Germany had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. The mighty French army had collapsed in just 6 weeks. Britain stood alone, and across Europe, millions believed that Hitler's war machine simply could not be defeated. Every victory made Hitler more confident, and he became convinced that his army was invincible. But despite controlling most of Europe, there was one nation he had always intended to destroy: the Soviet Union. For Hitler, this was far more than another military campaign. He believed Germany needed more land, more resources, and complete control over Eastern Europe, while also destroying what he saw as his greatest ideological enemy. Most importantly, he believed the Soviet Union would collapse within just a few months, a belief that would become one of the greatest military miscalculations in history. On June 22, 1941, without even declaring war, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion the world had ever seen. Nearly 4 million Axis soldiers, more than 3,000 tanks, thousands of aircraft, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, and an enormous supply network stretched across an almost 1,800-mile front. Hitler's strategy was straightforward. One army group would capture Leningrad in the north, another would seize Moscow in the center, and a third would conquer Ukraine and the resource-rich southern regions. German commanders confidently predicted that the Soviet Union would collapse before winter arrived and expected the campaign to end in less than 4 months. In the opening weeks, everything seemed to go exactly as planned. German armored divisions advanced with incredible speed. Soviet defenses crumbled, and entire armies were surrounded before they had a chance to regroup. The Red Army was caught completely off guard. Hundreds of Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. Communication systems collapsed, and millions of Soviet soldiers were captured during the first months of the invasion. One city after another fell into German hands, while newspapers around the world declared that the Soviet Union was finished. Even many experienced German generals believed the war had already been won. But beneath the surface, something extraordinary was beginning to happen. Instead of surrendering, the Soviet people chose to resist with everything they had. Factories continued operating despite constant bombing. Railroads transported supplies around the clock, and millions of civilians volunteered for the war effort. Engineers, factory workers, women, teenagers, and elderly citizens all became part of an enormous national mobilization. Germany had expected a quick victory, but instead it had awakened an entire nation determined to survive at any cost. Joseph Stalin, who had ignored numerous intelligence warnings that Germany was preparing to invade, was initially shocked by the scale of the attack. For several days, the Soviet leadership struggled to organize an effective response, but soon an unprecedented mobilization began. One of the most remarkable decisions in modern history was made. Thousands of factories would be dismantled, loaded onto trains, transported more than 1,000 miles east beyond the Ural Mountains, and rebuilt while the war was still raging. It sounded impossible, yet the Soviet Union accomplished exactly that. As German bombers devastated cities in the West, entirely new industrial centers were rising deep inside Soviet territory, safely beyond the reach of enemy aircraft. These factories would soon produce enormous numbers of tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition, laying the foundation for one of history's greatest industrial miracles. At the same time, Germany was beginning to face a problem that Hitler had completely underestimated. He believed that destroying Soviet armies would automatically end the war, but he failed to understand the sheer size of the Soviet Union. Even after losing vast territories, the country still possessed enormous resources, millions of people, and enough land to continue fighting. Every mile the German army advanced made its own situation more difficult. Supply lines became dangerously long, fuel deliveries slowed, roads turned into thick mud after heavy rains, vehicles constantly broke down, food and ammunition became harder to transport, and replacement parts often arrived too late. The deeper Germany pushed into Soviet territory, the weaker its logistical system became. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued rebuilding its strength. Every destroyed tank was replaced with another, every lost aircraft was matched by new production, and every setback only strengthened the determination of the Soviet people. Germany had entered the campaign believing it would fight a short war of speed, but the Soviet Union was preparing for a long war of endurance, and history would soon reveal which strategy would decide the fate of World War II. As autumn turned into winter, Hitler remained convinced that victory was only days away. German forces had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow, and many foreign observers believed the Soviet capital would fall before Christmas. Some German soldiers could already see the distant skyline of the city, believing they had reached the final stage of the campaign. But then, everything began to change. Heavy autumn rains transformed the roads into endless seas of mud, trapping tanks, trucks, and artillery. Supplies slowed to a crawl, fuel became increasingly scarce, and exhausted German soldiers found themselves struggling against an enemy they had never truly prepared for: distance, weather, and time. Soon, temperatures plunged far below freezing. Engines refused to start, machine guns jammed, oil thickened inside vehicles, and thousands of soldiers suffered from severe frostbite because many had never been issued proper winter uniforms. Hitler had expected the war to end before winter, so Germany simply wasn't equipped for a prolonged campaign. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was preparing its response. Stalin transferred fresh, highly trained Siberian divisions to defend Moscow after intelligence confirmed that Japan would not attack from the east. These troops were experienced in fighting under extreme winter conditions and arrived with skis, white camouflage, and equipment specifically designed for freezing temperatures. In early December 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive that shocked the German High Command. For the first time since the beginning of the war, German forces were forced into a large-scale retreat. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht had been shattered, proving to the entire world that Hitler's armies could be stopped. Yet while Moscow survived, another unimaginable tragedy was unfolding in the north. The city of Leningrad was surrounded by German and Finnish forces, beginning one of the longest and deadliest sieges in human history. For nearly 900 days, millions of civilians endured relentless bombardment, starvation, freezing temperatures, and unimaginable hardship. Food became so scarce that families survived on tiny pieces of bread made from flour mixed with sawdust and other substitutes. Despite the suffering, the city refused to surrender. Factories continued producing weapons under constant shelling. Musicians performed concerts to inspire civilians and soldiers, and defenders held their positions against overwhelming odds. Every day that Leningrad resisted tied down large numbers of German troops who could have been used elsewhere. At the same time, deep beyond the Ural Mountains, the Soviet industrial miracle was reaching full strength. Thousands of relocated factories were now operating around the clock, producing astonishing numbers of T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket launchers, artillery pieces, aircraft, ammunition, and military equipment at a pace Germany struggled to match. Workers often labored 12 to 16 hours a day. Women replaced men who had gone to the front lines. Teenagers entered factories before finishing school, and entire communities dedicated themselves to supplying the Red Army. While Germany's production faced increasing shortages of fuel and raw materials, Soviet industry continued expanding month after month. Hitler had hoped to destroy Soviet military power within a single campaign, but instead he found himself trapped in a long war of attrition against an opponent whose manpower, industrial capacity, and determination continued growing stronger. By the middle of 1942, Germany still controlled vast territories, but the momentum of the war was beginning to shift. Hitler now believed capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus would secure final victory, leading him to launch another massive offensive toward southern Russia. That decision would soon pull the German army into a city on the banks of the Volga River, a city whose name would become legendary across the world: Stalingrad. There, one of the bloodiest and most decisive battles in human history was about to begin, and it would forever change the fate of World War II. By the summer of 1942, Hitler believed one final offensive would bring Germany complete victory. Instead of focusing once again on Moscow, he ordered his armies to advance toward the rich oil fields of the Caucasus, while simultaneously capturing the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. He believed that controlling the city's factories, transportation routes, and symbolic connection to Joseph Stalin would break Soviet morale forever. At first, German forces pushed deep into southern Russia, and fierce bombing raids reduced much of Stalingrad to rubble. Hitler expected the city to fall within days, but the destruction actually favored the defenders. The ruins became a deadly maze where Soviet soldiers fought from shattered buildings, factories, basements, and sewers, turning every street and every room into a battlefield. The fighting became so brutal that soldiers often battled only a few yards apart, and control of a single building could change hands several times in one day. The Soviet defenders refused to retreat, repeating the simple order that the Volga River was the last line of defense. While Germany poured more and more troops into the city, Soviet commanders secretly prepared one of the greatest counterattacks in military history. In November 1942, Operation Uranus was launched, not against the strongest German units inside Stalingrad, but against the weaker Romanian and Hungarian forces protecting the flanks. Within days, Soviet armored forces smashed through these defenses and completely surrounded Germany's 6th Army, trapping more than 250,000 Axis soldiers inside the city. Hitler refused every suggestion to order a breakout, insisting that the army would hold its ground and be supplied by air. That decision proved catastrophic. German transport aircraft could deliver only a fraction of the food, ammunition, and fuel the trapped army required. As winter tightened its grip, starvation, disease, freezing temperatures, and constant Soviet attacks destroyed the once proud German force. In February 1943, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered, marking the first time a German field marshal had ever been captured alive. The defeat at Stalingrad shocked the world and completely changed the psychological balance of the war. From that moment onward, Germany was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting to survive. Determined to regain the initiative, Hitler launched another massive offensive during the summer of 1943 at Kursk, creating the largest tank battle in history. Expecting another rapid breakthrough, Germany instead encountered deeply prepared Soviet defensive lines stretching for hundreds of miles, packed with mines, anti-tank guns, trenches, and hidden artillery. When the German attack finally began, the Red Army absorbed the assault before launching powerful counteroffensives that permanently ended Germany's ability to conduct large-scale strategic offensives on the Eastern Front. From then on, the Soviet Union maintained the initiative. Throughout 1944, massive operations such as Operation Barbarossa annihilated entire German army groups, liberated Belarus, Ukraine, and much of Eastern Europe, while the Red Army advanced relentlessly toward Germany itself. Soviet industry was now producing tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition in numbers that Germany could no longer match, while Allied bombing campaigns crippled German factories and supply networks in the West. Germany was now trapped in a devastating two-front war that stretched its remaining resources beyond the breaking point. Finally, in April 1945, the Red Army launched its final assault on Berlin. Street by street and building by building, Soviet forces fought their way through the German capital until they reached the center of Nazi power. As Soviet troops closed in, Adolf Hitler remained inside his underground bunker, refusing to accept that the war was lost. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler died inside the bunker, and only days later, Berlin surrendered. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany officially surrendered, ending the war in Europe. The Soviet Union had paid an unimaginable price, losing an estimated 27 million military personnel and civilians, suffering destruction across thousands of cities and villages. Yet it had also destroyed the majority of Germany's military forces on the Eastern Front and played a decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany. The victory was not the result of one battle, one general, or one harsh winter alone. It was the result of extraordinary industrial production, relentless military adaptation, immense sacrifice, strategic resilience, and the determination of millions of ordinary people who refused to surrender despite facing one of the greatest invasions in human history. The story of how the Soviet Union won World War II remains one of history's most remarkable examples of endurance, resilience, and the incredible cost of victory, forever changing the balance of global power and,